This is The Legacy from Selma, Alabama. Here's Isley Gooden.
Welcome to The Legacy. I'm Isley Gooden here in Montgomery, Alabama. In the next half hour, we'll celebrate the heroes of the American Civil Rights Movement, and we'll also remember the violence that these fellow Americans had to deal with that led to changes like the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now we're going inside the Legacy Museum, from enslavement to incarceration, a site in Montgomery, Alabama where Black people previously were forced to labor. Drawing more than 500,000 visitors a year, the museum provides a comprehensive history of the United States with a focus on the legacy of enslavement. An entire wing in the museum explores the economics of the enslavement, the violence, and sexual violence of enslaved people. The site's expansive content on lynching includes a stunning wall of 800 mason jars of soil from where victims were lynched. They tell stories of racial segregation, voting barriers, mass incarceration, and more. The Legacy Museum, From Slavery to Incarceration, is designed to promote a more hopeful commitment to racial equality and treatment of all people. It did not happen without great cost. We'll speak with civil rights activist Brian Stevenson. He's now the executive director and founder of the Legacy Museum here in Montgomery, Alabama. Thanks so much for sitting down with us today. I first want to start with how yesterday we went to the Legacy Museum and it was absolutely beautifully done. It was so moving. Definitely cried going through there and watching some of the films and work that you guys have put out. And I just wanted to know, what was your mission when putting that here in Montgomery?
Yeah, well, I went to South Africa and spent time at the Apartheid Museum and was really struck by the fact that it was a truth-telling space. It was a narrative museum, and I reflected on the fact that we didn't really have cultural sites like that in America. I went to Berlin to see the Holocaust Memorial and had the same reaction. So for me, it became important to create a cultural space that talked honestly about the history of racial inequality, that made connections between these various eras, the era of enslavement and lynching and racial terror and segregation, and then contemporary issues. And the motivation, frankly, was to create an experience that allowed people to more honestly engage with this history and be motivated to recognize the importance of challenging new manifestations of that. When you go to the Holocaust Museum in DC, it's probably the only narrative museum we have in the country before ours. You're motivated to say never again because of what you see, what you learn, what you experience in that space. And I think we have the same motivation. We want people committed to recognizing the problem, the horror, the unacceptability of bigotry and discrimination and violence rooted in racial animus. And as we say at the end of the museum, the purpose of the space is to create a world where the children of our children are no longer burdened by a presumption of dangerousness and guilt that is connected to this history of racial hierarchy and racial discrimination, to create a world where we are literally free from the consequences of the horrific injustice that has characterized so much of American history for nearly 400 years.
And obviously this isn't your first time working in social justice and educating people. What made you want to get into your field of work?
Yeah, well, I'm a lawyer, obviously, and have spent most of my career representing people who have been wrongly convicted or unfairly sentenced or condemned to death. And that came out of just my own experience growing up in a community where Black children couldn't attend the public schools. So I started my education in a colored school. There were no high schools for Black kids when my dad was a teenager, so he couldn't go to high school in our county. And lawyers came into the community and made them open up the public schools, and that intervention created all kinds of opportunities for kids like me. And I recognized that if you had a vote in that community, because the community was majority white, people would never have voted to let kids like me attend those schools. But because of the commitment to the rule of law that we have in this society, those lawyers could compel that community to do what the law required. And that made an impression. When I graduated from high school, I went to college. I decided to go to law school because I wanted to use that same power the lawyers had used to create opportunities for me to help other people. And when I graduated from Harvard Law School in the 1980s, it was clear to me the community most at risk in American society was the growing population of people who had been sentenced to our jails and prisons. Our prison population went from about 300,000 in the early 1970s to 2.2 million today. So the United States has the highest rate of incarceration in the world, with the most punitive society on the planet. And I knew that the politics of fear and anger had created real barriers to justice and fair review for thousands of incarcerated people. So that's what motivated me to go into this kind of legal work. And we've been doing this legal work at the Equal Justice Initiative for over 30 years. We continue to do that work, and we'll still fight that fight. But about 12 years ago, I began to worry that we've gotten to a point in this society where I'm not sure we could win Brown versus Board of Education today. I'm not sure our court today would do something that disruptive on behalf of a disfavored group. And that made me want to get outside of the courts and begin talking about this history, because the narrative of our experience, our relationship to this legacy of racial injustice, is going to have an impact on how we use the law, our willingness to use the law to protect everyone. And so public education work around this history became a bigger priority. Here in Montgomery, Alabama, when I moved here in the 80s, you could not find the word slave, slavery, or enslavement on any public markers. It just wasn't acknowledged. We have 59 markers and monuments to the Confederacy. Jefferson Davis's birthday is still a state holiday in Alabama. Confederate Memorial Day is still a state holiday. We don't have Martin Luther King Day here. We have Martin Luther King / Robert E. Lee Day. And the iconography of the region, in my judgment, tells a false history, a false story about what's glorious. And so we felt like we had to challenge that, to change that. And the research that we've done, and then the public history projects, have been an important part of that. And, we're not trying to, to challenge people. We're not trying to frustrate people. We're really just trying to create an environment where we can all move toward freedom, where we can all have a shared pride in who we are. In Germany, you can't go 200 meters without seeing the markers and icons and stones that honor the victims of the Holocaust. And as a result of that, they've created a very different society. They've reckoned with that history. Every German student is required to go to the Holocaust sites. There are no Adolf Hitler statues in Berlin. There are no monuments to the perpetrators of the Holocaust. And I think we can learn from that and what it has yielded there, and benefit from the kind of truth and justice, truth and reconciliation, truth and restoration that I think awaits us here. And that's really been the motivation for adding to the legal work, this kind of narrative work, this goal of helping our society recover from this long history of inequality.
And I even noticed the markers here are just, it's so nice to have that and be able to know what actually happened in each spot. Do you like the progress that the city has made here?
Well, we've put up all of the markers that, that talk about this history, and I do like that there's kind of an openness. I think when we first started this, there was a bit of fear about whether this could be done without creating a lot of conflict. We didn't get support from a lot of the historical organizations. But I think the success of the sites have helped people just not fear truth-telling about history in quite the same way, and I think that's really important. I come from a faith tradition, and I am persuaded that truth and reconciliation, truth and restoration, truth and repair, these things are sequential. You can't skip the truth part and just jump to reconciliation or restoration or even reparation. Because if you don't tell the truth, you don't actually know what you're trying to repair. You don't know what you're trying to address. And, in the church where I come from, you can't come in and say, I want heaven and salvation and redemption and all that good stuff, but I'm not going to admit to anything. The pastors will tell you that you've got to confess and repent. And you shouldn't fear it, because it actually creates a consciousness about what should be avoided moving forward, what we should never tolerate. And I just don't think we've done that collectively as a society. So locally, I am encouraged by a growing comfort level with the truth-telling. Now, there have been economic benefits for the city, and that has helped, obviously. But I'd like to think that there is also a genuine interest in understanding more, doing more, seeing more, that helps us get to a better place when it comes to overcoming this legacy and not just replicating it with new manifestations, which has happened, I think, since the first Africans came to this country in 1619. So yes, I'm encouraged by the progress we're making. We have a project where we're putting markers at lynching sites all over the country. I think that history should be marked and acknowledged. And we've now worked with 80 communities across the country and had markers erected in those communities. We're working with a couple of hundred more now. So that's been very affirming and encouraging too.
And like you said, facing things head on, how important is that, especially as now that I've been to some of your sites and here you guys have a lot of the facts about children that are imprisoned or about how race is a big factor in people being sentenced. Why is it important to talk about why race is a big factor, or just the facts in general to be out there?
Yeah, I think we will not adequately understand the frustration and rage when there's a videotape killing of an African American by a law enforcement officer, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery. These incidents reflect our failure to deal with the presumption of dangerousness and guilt that gets assigned to Black and brown people in this country. And it doesn't matter whether you're an acclaimed journalist, whether you're a teacher, whether you're a doctor, whether you're a lawyer, whether you're kind, whether you're loving. If you're Black or brown, you will often need to navigate a presumption of dangerousness and guilt. The burden becomes yours to have a safe encounter with law enforcement or to avoid some dangerous misjudgment about who you are. And that's not right, and that's not fair. But you won't see that issue, and you certainly won't understand that issue unless you appreciate the historical context that has created that issue. And that's why we want to talk about the real evil of American slavery, which was the narrative that was created to justify enslavement, which is that Black people aren't as good as white people, less capable, less worthy, less deserving. And by explaining that, and then the way that was manifest for a century after the Civil War through terror violence and lynching, and then codified through segregation, I think makes it easier to then understand how we are now at this moment where there's tremendous anxiety and concern about police violence that gets directed at people of color, about the anguish that Black parents have when they send their children out into the world worried that they're going to be at a greater risk of some a tragic encounter. The disparities that we see, we don't understand why it's significant that the Bureau of Justice has projected that 1 in 3 Black male babies born in this country is expected to go to jail or prison in 2001 if we don't understand the historical context. And so yes, it is important for us to make these connections so we're better prepared and motivated to eliminate the kind of bigotry and discrimination that is still too pervasive in American society.
And it can kind of be dangerous to keep those rhetorics hidden and make sure that people don't talk about them.
Absolutely. I think the very strength of our democracy is at risk when we do not understand this history, when we do not see the ways in which historically fear and anger has given rise to mob violence that has caused lawlessness and trauma to millions of people. Fear and anger has caused us to create a legal architecture that can't be reconciled with a constitution that says equality and justice for all. We tolerated that until very recently. I was born at a time where the laws didn't permit Black and white people to marry, Black children to be in schools with white kids, and that thinking is a real threat to American democracy. And so we have to talk about it or it will manifest itself again. And we've even seen recently manifestations of that kind of fear and anger creating new threats going to an attack on Congress where people are bringing nooses and gallows and using the imagery of racial oppression, all of that I think is tolerated by some because there isn't an awareness of this history. So yes, I do think it is dangerous to not learn this history, to not engage with this history, and to not be motivated by this history to create less bigotry, less discrimination, less violence, less racism, less hatred of people because of who they are. If we're not all trying to advance those objectives, I think we're really vulnerable to some very unhealthy developments that can undermine democracy.
And as the civil rights movement has kind of moved and things are changing and we're still fighting now for Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, those people that are still being murdered by police and others, what can you kind of say to people that are saying, well, when Martin Luther King was fighting, no one was violent, and now as they're going to protest, things are escalating, looting and things like that?
Yeah, I don't think it's a fair characterization to say that most of the activism today is violent. Everyone I'm familiar with who was engaged in protests around police violence were committed to nonviolence. There's always been an element of violence that can be seen somewhere. But the thrust of the argument is that we need to eliminate bias. We need to eliminate violence. We need to eliminate the kind of fear that creates these risks. And I mean, Martin Luther King was killed by an act of violence. It's always been true that there have been violent reactions to protests. There have always been violent resistance to change. The beautiful thing is that we've made a lot of progress non-violently, and that's certainly my commitment and my orientation. I am still persuaded that if enough of us stand up for the things that matter, even when people say sit down, if enough of us speak for the things that are right, even when people say be quiet, we will achieve the kind of equality, the kind of justice, the kind of change that I think our nation needs. But more than that, that is consistent with this constitutional idea of equality and justice for all.
And as Martin Luther King also worked with veterans as well, African American veterans, do you think that that's still something important that people should be giving them more aid and helping them transition?
I absolutely do. We have a report on the lynching of black veterans because most people don't know that veterans were targeted after their participation in World War I and World War II. They were more at risk of lynching violence. My dad was a combat vet, fought in the Korean conflict, and he couldn't get the benefits of the GI Bill because we allocated management of that resource to the states. And that means that black veterans didn't have the same opportunities for opportunity and growth. And there's a legacy to that as well. So I absolutely think that we owe veterans more than we have provided them, and that if you risk your life fighting for freedom and justice abroad, at the very least you should be offered that freedom and justice at home. And we haven't done that throughout our history. And so yes, there is a special, I think, obligation to do more with our veterans and those who have risked the most to defend the principles that have sustained this country when it comes to our desire to be great.
And after learning so much and visiting the sites here, how can we move forward in healing and maybe helping out?
I think knowledge is an important part of that. I think learning is doing something. We don't always see that, but to learn is to do. And I think if we learn, we just better position ourselves to understand what the obligations are, what the requirements are, what the tasks are that we have to now pursue to advance those goals. So one of the things we invite people to do is we have a calendar. You can order it online, but you can also just sign up, and each day we will send you something about our history. And that information becomes a real basis for knowing more, to do the things that are required to create, I think, a more hopeful future. I'm persuaded that is an important component of what's going to be required. And then we invite people to come and visit us. We think spending time in spaces like our spaces is a really a necessary step to creating a consciousness that allows us to get to where we're trying to go.
A sister site of the Legacy Museum is the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. This is the first place in America dedicated to recognizing thousands of victims of racial terror and lynching. Nearly 5,000 African American men, women, and children were terrorized from 1877 to 1950. Now, for the first time in the United States, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, founded by Brian Stevenson, is acknowledging the victims of racial terror lynchings. Seeing the hundreds of victims' names who were hung, burned alive, shot, drowned, and beaten by white mobs evokes unimaginable emotion. Set on 6 acres atop a rise overlooking Montgomery, the National Lynching Memorial is a sacred space for truth and a reflection about racial terror. Montgomery, Alabama is home to over 10 sites on the Civil Rights Trail. One of the first I visited was the Rosa Parks Museum, located at the site of Mrs. Parks' arrest on December 1st, 1955, featuring a restored bust and artifacts.
For the longest time, there was only an historic marker on the site, commemorating Mrs. Parks' arrest. And there was nothing else in the city dedicated to her and that act of bravery.
There, they strive to raise awareness to the history while also inspiring visitors.
Yeah, and we get visitors from all over the world who come through here. Again, some think they know the story of Rosa Parks. Some do know more than others. But really that racism and all of these other issues, the South has gotten a bad rap for them with just cause, but they're not strictly a Southern issue. And so, again, we want to challenge people to go out into their own communities, and if they see these injustices or, inequity or inequality, to do something about them. And just that the strategies that came into play here can be used in all these other ways. And so just go back into your own communities and be those agents of change like people like Rosa Parks were.
Next, we made our way to the Freedom Rides Museum, the site of the attack on the Freedom Riders. This bus station has been restored to how it looked back in 1961.
When the Freedom Riders arrived here, and 10 years after the facility was built, this was the place where they were attacked as they peacefully protested the segregation that was occurring here in violation of federal law. Greyhound did go on to integrate this building because of the courage of the Freedom Riders and their courageous action. And then it's operated on an integrated basis for almost another 30 years. When Greyhound moved out, the facility was scheduled to be torn down, to be demolished. The Alabama Historical Commission joined and led the chorus of voices in the community that this was a place that was important and significant to American history and should be preserved. And so we set about trying to save it. We were able to save about a portion of the building for the use and to turn it into the Freedom Rides Museum, which has been here since 2011 in the city.
The museum itself is small with a large message that every day people have big roles in changing history. And how do you think that can inspire people as, like you said, we're now in a modern civil rights movement today, and we don't know when things will be at a certain point. How can that inspire people that are still involved in this right now?
Well, we hope that when people come to the Freedom Rides Museum, that there were 436 Freedom Riders that came from all across the country, from all different backgrounds. They were black, they were white, they were young, they were female, male, some were clergy, some had families, some were students. We hope that by seeing the diversity of the people who got involved in this movement, that will inspire people and help them to understand that we all have a role to play when it comes to change.
Montgomery is also the home to the Civil Rights Memorial Center, honoring the martyrs who died for equal rights.
We not only get to talk about the individuals, but we also get to talk about some of the significant events of the modern civil rights movement. Of course, we know that the civil rights movement did not begin with Brown versus Board of Education, nor did it end with the Selma to Montgomery March, because we are still very much fighting for some of those rights today.
It's important to the center to share stories of present-day civil rights battles.
We really believe that cultural institutions are places where we can see advancement for racial justice issues.
These are just a few civil rights museums and monuments to visit in Montgomery, Alabama. We hope you enjoyed the legacy. Thank you for watching.